Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, a series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Ulysses Grant, and the focus is the miseries of the Johnson administration. The year is 1865. It's April. Abraham Lincoln has just been assassinated, and Andrew Johnson takes over as the 17th President of the United States. Now, Johnson was a Southern Democrat, but he had remained loyal to the Union throughout the war. In fact, he served as the wartime governor of Tennessee, working very closely with the Lincoln administration. And when it came time to run in 1864, Lincoln and the Republicans were actually a bit at odds. And so Lincoln created his own new party, the National Union Party, and what better than a loyal Southern Democrat to have on the ticket, help in Reconstruction, and that was Andrew Johnson. Johnson indicated at the time that he took over that his policies would be the same as Lincoln's, and the question is, what did that really mean, and could he pull it off? A lot of questions at this time. One of the things they could do was to celebrate the victory, and Johnson and Grant presided over a two-day event, 200,000 Union soldiers parading across to celebrate the victory in front of the White House. It was George Meade's Army of the Potomac on day one, William Sherman's Army of the Tennessee on day two. At least that was an opportunity for Grant and Johnson to be together in a bit of a celebratory mood. Most of the time that was not the case, and their conflict started actually from the very beginning. Now, Johnson had issued a pardon, a full amnesty for all the Confederate soldiers, but there were exceptions, mainly focused on the political class, the military leaders, and the wealthy, the businessmen, who Johnson blamed for funding and actually pushing for the rebellion. They had to come to him directly to ask for an individual pardon, but the rest, the frontline soldiers, had all received their amnesty. There was a question about the leaders, and there were starting to be some rumors that maybe Johnson was going to go out and arrest some of the Confederate generals, including Robert E. Lee. And Lee actually reached out to Grant to try to find out what was going on, and this came to a head in a cabinet meeting. When Johnson confronted Grant and basically said, how quickly can we start having trials for some of these Confederate generals? And Grant had a response. He said, absolutely never. According to Grant, I have made certain terms with Lee, the best and only terms. If I had told him and his army that their liberty would be invaded and they would be open to arrest, trial, and execution for treason, Lee would have never surrendered, and we should have lost many lives in destroying him. My terms of surrender were according to military law, and so long as General Lee observes his parole, I will never consent to his arrest. I will resign the command of the army rather than execute any order to arrest Lee or any of his commanders so long as they obey the law. Couldn't be much more firm than that. Johnson backed down. Well, Grant got away. In fact, the only times he seemed to have any enjoyment during this period when he was outside of Washington, D.C., and he was celebrated on the ride back to his hometown of Galena, Illinois. When he got there was another huge celebration, got a hero's welcome, lots of gifts, including a new home. He was gifted a home in Galena, but that wasn't the only home. In effect, he was gifted a home in Washington as well. He and Juliet bought a house for about $30,000 they took out a loan for in Washington, D.C., but turn around and this guy, Daniel Butterfield, who had been the chief of staff to General Hooker during the war, got a group together to raise money to thank the general for his services to the country. It was $105,000. He paid off the house, put the other $75K in his pocket. Didn't seem to have any problem with this. Civil servant, doesn't matter in this case. He had earned it. He was happy to receive these gifts. Well, back in Washington, the struggles with Andrew Johnson continued. Grant didn't like Johnson's approach to Reconstruction, in fact, because he thought it was too generous to the South. He was letting them get away with these new black codes, these slave-like conditions that were being created in the South. And Grant and Johnson, in his version of Reconstruction, really wasn't going to touch this. States' rights, he was going to let the states do what they want. And Grant kind of thought he was basically backtracking on what they had just won on the field of battle. But right now, Grant mostly kept these opinions to himself. Johnson was really fighting with Congress. The radical Republicans in Congress had a very different view of what either Lincoln or now Johnson had in terms of the relationship with the South. They certainly didn't like this generosity in the states' rights perspective that Johnson was pursuing. The radicals wanted, frankly, some revenge, but also to make sure that they were uplifting the free blacks into some level of citizenship that they were seeing was now at odds with what was happening in the state government. So Johnson and the radical Republicans in Congress are really at each other. So Johnson decides to go on the road, a swing around the circle. He was going to go visit 10 states over 3 weeks, give some speeches and rally for support, maybe influence the midterm elections. And he wanted an entourage, including war heroes like General Grant. Problem for Grant was, it was kind of embarrassing. He got so much more applause and welcoming when he was introduced than when Johnson was, so that was awkward, but it was actually worse. Grant couldn't stand Johnson and his speeches because he was getting into arguments with the people. It started out pretty well, but when he got into the Midwest states, the radical Republicans actually started heckling Johnson, trying to get him to make a mistake or say something inappropriate, and he took their bait, and Grant couldn't stand it. As he said in a letter to Julia back home, "I've never been so tired of anything before as I have been with the political stump speeches of Mr. Johnson from Washington to this place. I look at them as a national disgrace, this bickering of a president of the United States with the population in front of him." Well, tensions grew back in Washington when Johnson decided to send Grant on a new kind of mission, a diplomatic mission to Mexico. Now, Grant's thinking, that's not in my job jar. Why are you doing this? And he actually thought that Johnson might be trying to get rid of him, get him out of the role as commanding general, maybe replace him with William Sherman. And Grant said, "I'm not going to go." Well, Johnson looked at his attorney general and said, "Can he not follow my orders?" And Grant interrupted before the AG could respond and told the president, "I am an officer of the Army and bound to obey your military orders. But this is a civil office, a purely diplomatic duty that you offer me, and I cannot be compelled to undertake it." At that point, he got up and he left, and Johnson dropped the issue. The biggest conflicts, though, were to come, and again, these were based on laws being passed by the radical Republicans in Congress, not only to go out against Johnson, but really to attack the presidency itself. The first was the Military Reconstruction Act. Obviously, this one was going to have Grant in it, and Grant was right in the middle of not only this one, but the next act as well. We'll start, though, with military reconstruction. This created 5 districts in the South across the 10 seceded states. Now, Tennessee, which was the 11th seceded state, had already been welcomed back into the Union, so they aren't affected. But the other 10 states were now basically under military control. 20,000 troops were sent to the South, and this was really to enforce, frankly, the will of Congress, because Andrew Johnson, the president, was effectively cut out of the chain of command. In this statute, the commanders in these military districts had full authority really to do whatever they wanted, and they answered only to the commanding general, Ulysses Grant, not to the president. And again, typically you've got the president as commander-in-chief, so says the Constitution, gives those orders either through the Secretary of War or to the commanding general, and they follow them. In this case, Grant kind of had the authority to choose which direction he wanted to go, and then he and the military commanders could go execute on that. Well, Johnson thought this was unconstitutional. He was very vocal against it, but it was nothing he felt he could do about it. So 5 new commanders were put in place, but the one thing that Johnson did think he could do, if he didn't like the commanders, they may not have to listen to his orders, he could fire them. And that's what he wanted to do, particularly with General Phil Sheridan. Now, Sheridan was one of Grant's favorites. Grant was really fond of Sheridan. He was a hero from the war, and he didn't really think that Sheridan was doing anything wrong, but Johnson saw Sheridan as going beyond his authority and really questioning the president's, and he wanted him out. He was insistent. Grant argued. They argued about this for quite some time, but in the end, the president was unmoved, and Grant reluctantly fired Sheridan. He also fired Daniel Sickles, one of the other generals that Johnson got out. So tension's really high now between Johnson and Grant. Now we flip over to that other act, the Tenure of Office Act, another shot at the presidency where the president was no longer allowed to dismiss a civil officer who had been confirmed by the Senate. Well, this was a privilege that all presidents had had in the past. Johnson felt this was unconstitutional, but he again didn't have a mechanism to do much about it. And it was going to be triggered because he wanted to get rid of his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. Stanton was really getting much closer to the radical Republicans. Johnson thought he was trying to undermine him and he wanted him gone. So in August of 1867, he sent off a letter to fire Stanton. And Stanton effectively said, "No, I'm not going to go, and you don't have the authority to fire me without Senate approval." Well, what Johnson did have the authority to do, because Congress was not in session at this moment, he could suspend Stanton per the act, but he needed somebody to step in between in the interim. and that he looked to Ulysses Grant. He wanted Grant to become Secretary of War ad interim and then see what happens when the Senate comes back. Now, Grant, again, stuck in the middle, not a place he wanted to be, but he told Julia why he took the job. I consented to do so as I think it's most important that someone should be there who cannot be used. So Grant's now both the commanding general and the acting Secretary of War. A couple of months later, Congress comes back, and sure enough, a Senate committee votes to upend the suspension and put Secretary Stanton back in his office. This gave Johnson a couple of days to figure out what to do before the full Senate voted, and he got together with Grant. They talked about a couple of options that Johnson put on the table. The first was that Grant just refused to step down. He stays in his role as the acting Secretary of War, and that he and Johnson would go to court together to fight against the unconstitutional provision in the Tenure of Office Act. The second opportunity was, if Grant didn't want to do that, was that at least Grant would resign, give the interim job back to Johnson so Johnson could appoint someone else who would go to court with him, again, before Stanton could take the job back. Well, Grant went off to think about this, didn't have a lot of time, and he wasn't in favor of option number one. Violating the Tenure of Office Act came with a $10,000 fine, imprisonment. This was not something he was going to mess with. But he did seem to indicate he would go along with number two. If Stanton was going to be reinstated, he would resign the position, give it back to Johnson to give it to somebody else. That was the understanding, at least, that Johnson had. So a couple days later, sure enough, the Senate voted overwhelmingly to put Stanton back in his office. Grant is in his office at the War Department. So what did he do? Packed up his things, locked his door, took the key, gave it to the Adjutant General, and left the building. Edwin Stanton comes on a couple of hours later. He goes to that same Adjutant General, E.D. Townsend, and says, "Can I have the key to my office?" Got the key, went back in. He's now back being Secretary of War, and Andrew Johnson and the cabinet were livid. Livid with Ulysses Grant. What happened to their plan? So sure enough, Grant is hauled in front of the cabinet the next day, and Johnson confronts him and said, "Weren't you going to resign and give the job back to me to give to someone else?" And Grant opened up, said, "That was my intention," and then he continued to sort of explain why that never happened. Although, frankly, it wasn't a very good explanation, but at this point, Grant was kind of done with this whole thing. He was disgusted by it, and he basically got up and left abruptly. Well, he and Johnson weren't done. Letter writing, back and forth over the next several days, several letters. They got more and more personal, contentious, and Grant finally said enough is enough. And he wrote a letter to the President of the United States that said, "And now, Mr. President, when my honor as a soldier and integrity as a man have been so violently assailed, pardon me for saying that I can but regard this whole matter, from the beginning to the end, as an attempt to involve me in the resistance of law, and thus to destroy my character before the country." He was out of it. He told the president, "I'm not taking orders from you anymore. Per that law, the Military Reconstruction Act, I'm only going to follow orders from the Secretary of War." Well, this wasn't over because Johnson still wanted Stanton out, and Johnson indeed did go and fire Edwin Stanton. And this created a crisis between the executive branch and the legislative branch. Stanton refused to leave his office. He was holed up there. The radical Republicans pounced because now they had Johnson violating federal law. They impeached him over a weekend. Within a couple of weeks, he was on trial in the Senate to see if he could keep his job. He needed the Republicans rather, needed 35 votes to convict him. Johnson needed 19 to let him stay in office if they would vote not guilty. And in fact, he got 19. 9 Democrats and 10 Republicans voted not guilty, and Johnson kept his job. By one vote, he'd have a few months to write out the rest of his presidency. As soon as the vote on the first of the articles of impeachment was voted upon in the Senate, and it went against the radical Republicans and for Johnson, they actually took a break. Because the very next day was starting up in Chicago, the Republican National Convention. A lot of the senators wanted to go to that. Who was going to be replacing Andrew Johnson? Because that certainly was the hope of the Republicans, was to replace Johnson with the next president. And there was only one name that anybody considered at the Republican nominating convention in 1868, and that was Ulysses Grant. Nominated on the first ballot, it was unanimous, there was no question. Schuyler Colfax, the Speaker of the House, won the position as the vice presidential candidate. This was also a unifying force for the Republican Party. Grant was seen as a unifying force now for the country, but in the party as well. Remember, in 1864, Lincoln did not run as a Republican. He ran on the National Union ticket, a new party. And you can see from this banner, the National Union and the Republicans coming back together under the banner of Grant and Schuyler Colfax. Well, Grant didn't do any campaigning, but he did give one note in accepting the nomination. And it was ever so simple, just like Grant would be. And he simply said, "Let us have peace." And with that, let the campaign begin. And Grant didn't do any campaigning. He mostly spent time with his family, which he was happy to do. He took a trip out west with Sherman and Sheridan and his son Buck. They had a nice time. Eventually, this was not a close call during the election. The Electoral College went 73% for Grant, 214 to 80. He captured 26 out of the 34 states. He also won easily in the popular vote, as most of the 400,000 freedmen who were voting for the very first time all sided with Grant. Andrew Johnson was finally going to be out, and Grant was going from commanding general to commander-in-chief, and that is the story for another day. That is Ulysses Grant and the miseries of the Johnson administration from the life of Ulysses Grant. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.